Love is a luxury for people with safety nets. At 25, Rachel Hayes had neither. She spent her nights auditing ledgers in a decaying downtown hotel, watching the dregs of the city slide past the revolving glass doors. She knew how to spot a grifter, a junkie, or a liar before they even opened their mouths. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have prepared for, was the man who walked in at 3:14 a.m., bleeding onto her marble floor, carrying the kind of silence that precedes a murder. The Grand St. Clair was a monument to a city that no longer existed. Its brass railings were tarnished to the color of wet pennies, and the high vaulted ceilings of the lobby smelled permanently of stale carpet cleaner, old tobacco, and radiator grease. Behind the mahogany reception desk, Rachel Hayes lived in a state of calculated invisibility. She was 25 years old, though her eyes, a flat, unblinkingly observant gray, belonged to someone who had spent 50 years watching people lie about what they could afford. She wore an oversized wool cardigan over her uniform, her dark hair pulled back with a mechanical precision that said, "Do not look at me. Do not speak to me unless you have a credit card on file." Rachel did not believe in love. She didn't actively hate the concept. She simply viewed it with the same clinical detachment she applied to the hotel's quarterly tax liabilities. Love was an economic disadvantage. It required an investment of time and emotional capital that yielded erratic returns, usually ending in bankruptcy, bruises, or someone packing suitcases in the middle of the night while the children cried in the next room. She had seen her mother do it 3 times. She had watched her friends trade their independence for men who couldn't remember to pay the electric bill. Rachel preferred numbers. Numbers did not wake up one morning and decide they no longer found you attractive. A 5 was always a 5. A deficit was always a deficit. The digital clock on her monitor read 3:14 a.m. when the revolving glass door stopped spinning. The street outside was dead, blanketed in a heavy, wet November fog that muffled the sirens on the interstate. The man who walked into the lobby did not look like a guest. He did not carry luggage, and he did not check his watch. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat, tailored so precisely around the shoulders that it looked like armor, though the left sleeve was visibly darker, soaked through with something thick and light-absorbing. His face was hard, carved out of sharp angles and shadow, with a jawline set so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. He looked to be in his early 30s, possessing the kind of cold, heavy physical presence that immediately sucked the air out of the room. He didn't walk to the desk. He arrived at it. One heavy hand, knuckles split and smeared with grease and rust-colored dried blood, gripped the brass edge of the counter. "I need a room," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't hold the panic of a victim or the arrogance of a drunk. It was flat, utilitarian, the voice of a man who gave orders to people who didn't ask questions. Rachel didn't flinch. Her heart executed a single hard thump against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on her keyboard. She took in the dark stain on his coat. The faint, unmistakable copper smell of fresh arterial blood that drifted over the mahogany, the slight favoring drag of his right leg. "We're booked," she said, her voice matching his. Level, devoid of customer service warmth. He leaned in slightly. His eyes were a dark, bottomless brown, practically black under the flickering fluorescent light of the desk lamp. There was no warmth in them, only a hyper-aware, predatory calculation. He wasn't looking at her like a woman. He was assessing her as an obstacle or an instrument. "The parking lot is empty," he said. The fourth floor lights are off. You have 22 vacant rooms. I need one that doesn't exist on the ledger for 12 hours. That's illegal, Rachel said. A humorless, razor-thin smile touched the corner of his mouth. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. He reached into his coat. Rachel's eyes flicked instinctively toward the movement, noting the heavy bulge of a holstered firearm beneath the leather shoulder strap, and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. He dropped it onto the ledger. It hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud. 10,000, he said softly. To forget you saw my face, to forget the coat, to leave the service elevator unlocked on the alley side. Rachel looked at the money. It was more than she made in 4 months of graveyard shifts. It was enough to fix the transmission on her car, pay off the remaining balance on her mother's medical debt, and buy 6 months of absolute breathing room. She looked back up at him. If you bleed on the mattress, the cleaning fee is $200 extra, and if the police come asking, I don't lie for free. This buys my silence for tonight. If someone puts a gun to my head tomorrow, I'm describing you down to the split on your knuckles. The man studied her, truly studied her, for the first time. The silence stretched between them, thick with the smell of ozone and copper. Most people shrank from him. He was used to fear, used to the frantic, stammering deference of people who knew what Gabriel Castellano did for a living. This girl wasn't brave. He could see the slight tremor in the pulse point at the side of her neck. But she was entirely, brutally practical. Fair enough, Gabriel said. Rachel reached under the desk, bypassed the electronic keycard encoder, and pulled out a heavy brass key attached to a faded plastic tag. Room 412. It was at the far end of the dead wing, where the security cameras had been disconnected since the renovation stalled in 2022. She slid the key across the mahogany, alongside the banded cash, which she swept into the drop safe beneath the register in one fluid motion. Service elevator is at the end of the hall to your left, she said, turning her eyes back to the glowing blue light of her monitor. Checkout is at 11, but somehow I doubt you'll be stopping by the front desk for a receipt. Gabriel took the key. He lingered for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes tracing the flat, unemotional line of her profile. What's your name? The girl who didn't see you, Rachel said. A low, quiet sound rattled in his chest. It might have been a laugh, or it might have been pain. He turned and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, leaving behind only the metallic tang of blood and the heavy, lingering reality that Rachel Hayes had just balanced a very dangerous equation. By 4:30 a.m., the adrenaline had dissolved into a cold, gritty fatigue. Rachel sat in the break room behind the front desk, staring at the vending machine. The fluorescent bulb inside flickered, casting a sickly greenish glow over the stale pastries and overpriced bags of potato chips. Her fingers tapped a rhythmic, restless beat against her ceramic mug of black coffee. She shouldn't go up there. It wasn't her business. Her business was the ledger, the cash drop, and making sure the drunk sales reps on the second floor didn't set off the smoke alarms. People who bled through tailored Italian wool at 3 a.m. didn't call ambulances for a reason. They were either running from the law or running from people who were worse than the law. In this city, the latter usually meant the Castellano Syndicate, the quiet, ruthlessly efficient organization that controlled the docks, the freight lines, and half the municipal unions from behind a wall of corporate shell companies. Rachel knew the names. Everyone who worked the night shift in the city knew the geography of the underworld. It was a survival metric, like knowing which subway lines flooded during a freeze. She looked at the industrial first aid kit mounted on the break room wall. It was a heavy white metal box, stocked 3 years ago and untouched since the maintenance guy sliced his thumb on a broken radiator. If he dies in room 412, the smell will ruin the carpet, she told herself. The manager will make me clean it. It was a lie. A practical, cynical justification to cover a strange, uncomfortable prickle of curiosity that she couldn't shake. She had seen the way he walked away from the desk, the rigid, forced control of his spine, the slight drag of his heel. He was losing blood fast. A man with $10,000 in his pocket didn't bleed to death in a $20 an hour night auditor's hotel without causing a massive, complicated problem for whoever was on shift when the body cooled. She unlocked the metal box, pulled out 2 rolls of heavy-duty gauze, a bottle of industrial-strength antiseptic, a pair of trauma shears, and a roll of white athletic tape. She dumped them into a plastic grocery bag, grabbed a clean towel from the laundry bin, and walked out into the empty lobby. The 4th floor smelled of old dust and damp plaster. The carpet here was a faded floral monstrosity that swallowed the sound of her sneakers. When she reached room 412, she didn't knock. Knocking gave people time to draw weapons. Instead, she slid her passkey into the mechanical lock and turned it with a sharp, definitive click. She pushed the door open 3 inches and stopped. "If you're going to shoot me, aim for the head," Rachel said into the dark room. "I don't have the health insurance for an abdominal wound." A heavy silence answered her, followed by the dry, metallic click of a hammer being lowered. "Come in," his voice came from the corner. It was weaker now, stripped of the gravelly command from the lobby, edged with the thin, sharp vibration of physical agony. Rachel pushed the door wide and stepped inside, using her elbow to flick on the bathroom vanity light. She didn't turn on the overhead lamps. The pale yellow glow from the bathroom spilled across the room, illuminating Gabriel Castellano sitting on the edge of the stripped mattress. His overcoat was on the floor, a dark, sodden heap. He had managed to get his shirt off his left shoulder, but the fabric was stuck to the wound on his upper arm, dried blood acting like a grotesque glue. His skin was the color of skim milk, his chest rising and falling in shallow, measured hitches. A compact black semi-automatic pistol rested on the mattress 6 inches from his right thigh. Rachel walked over, dropped the plastic bag onto the bedside table, and pulled up the single wooden desk chair, sitting down opposite him. She didn't look at the gun. "You're a terrible guest," she said, pulling the antiseptic and trauma shears from the bag. "I explicitly mentioned the carpet." Gabriel looked at her through half-lidded eyes. Sweat stood out in fine beads across his forehead, plastering his dark hair to his temples. "I told you to forget you saw me. I did. Now I'm looking at a liability who's about to pass out from blood loss and leave me with a biological hazard." She clicked the shears open. "Hold still. This is going to ruin your shirt." "The shirt is already ruined." She leaned in, her knees brushing his trousers. The heat radiating off him was feverish, a stark contrast to the drafty chill of the room. She slid the cold steel of the shears under the blood-stained cotton of his sleeve and cut upward with clean, efficient snips. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just watched her face, watching the absolute lack of squeamishness in her gray eyes, the steady, rhythmic movement of her hands. When she peeled the fabric away from the wound, she drew in a short, sharp breath through her nose. It wasn't a clean through and through. The bullet had torn a ragged, ugly furrow across the outer bicep, chipping the muscle and leaving a deep, weeping trench that was oozing dark, sluggish blood. "It's not in there," Rachel assessed, her voice clinical. "You got lucky. It grazed the bone, but it exited." "I know," Gabriel murmured. His eyes were locked on her face, tracking the line of her jaw. "Why are you doing this?" "I told you. The carpet—" "Stop lying," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "People like you don't do favors for people like me. You take the money and you lock yourself in the office until shift change." Rachel unscrewed the cap of the brown antiseptic bottle. She poured a generous splash onto the clean laundry towel. "People like me?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave as she pressed the soaked towel directly against the raw, open meat of his arm. Gabriel's entire body went rigid, his jaw clamped shut with a sound like two stones striking together, the tendons in his neck standing out like steel cables. A low, ragged hiss escaped through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. He didn't grab her wrist. He just endured it, his breathing turning into a hard, rhythmic rattle. "People who survive," Gabriel said, once the initial shock of the burn had subsided. His voice was strained, hoarse. "People who keep their heads down because they know what happens when you look up." Rachel began winding the heavy gauze around his bicep, pulling it tight enough to apply pressure. Her fingers moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had bandaged sprained ankles and kitchen cuts 100 times before. "I don't keep my head down because I'm afraid," Rachel said, securing the end of the bandage with a long strip of white athletic tape. She sat back, wiping a smear of his blood onto her jeans. She met his gaze squarely, her gray eyes cold and clear. "I keep my head down because looking up is a waste of energy. The world is divided into people who take and people who pay. I don't have anything left to take, and I'm done paying. So I stay out of the way." Gabriel studied her. The yellow light from the bathroom caught the sharp contours of his face, softening the brutality of his features just enough to reveal the profound, bone-deep exhaustion beneath. "Everyone pays, Rachel," he said softly. She froze, her hand hovering over the plastic bag. "I didn't give you my name." Gabriel gestured with his chin toward the left side of her cardigan. "You have an employee ID badge clipped to your pocket. Rachel Hayes, night auditor." Rachel looked down at the plastic card. She had forgotten she was wearing it. A slow, self-deprecating smirk touched her lips as she stood up, gathering the bloody shears and empty wrappers back into the bag. "See?" she said, turning toward the door. "That's why I don't get involved with people like you. You notice too much." "Rachel," he called out, just as her hand touched the brass doorknob. She paused, not looking back. "What?" "Lock the door when you leave," he said. "And don't come back up here, no matter what you hear between now and dawn." Dawn did not bring light to the city. It merely turned the black fog into a dirty, bruised gray. At 7 a.m., the morning manager, a balding, chronically anxious man named Arthur, arrived to relieve her. Rachel handed over the cash drawer, minus the $10,000, which was now securely taped to the underside of the spare tire in the trunk of her rusty 2011 Honda Civic, and signed the shift log. She should have gone home. Her apartment was a 30-minute drive toward the industrial district, a cold 2-room box above a dry cleaner where the heat worked only intermittently. Her bed was waiting. Her silence was waiting. Instead, She found herself standing in the aisle of the 24-hour bodega 3 blocks from the hotel, buying 2 black coffees, a box of heavy-duty bandages, a bottle of ibuprofen, and a prepaid burner phone. This is stupidity, she thought, as she paid the cashier, a bored teenager who didn't even look up from his phone. This is how people end up in the river with their ankles tied to cinder blocks. When she returned to the St. Clair, she bypassed the front lobby entirely, using her employee key card to enter through the loading dock. The freight elevator groaned as it lifted her to the 4th floor. The hallway was unchanged, still silent, still smelling of old dust. She stood outside room 412 for a long moment, listening. Nothing. No groans, no movement, no TV playing in the background. She slid her key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. Gabriel was exactly where she had left him, sitting on the edge of the mattress, though he had pulled a clean black t-shirt from somewhere, probably a compression shirt he'd worn under the dress shirt, and had stretched it carefully over his bandaged arm. He was leaning forward, his forearms resting on his knees, staring at the floor. The Glock was now tucked into the waistband of his trousers at the small of his back. He looked up when the door clicked. His eyes were sharper now, the feverish glaze replaced by a cold, hyper-alert focus. "I told you not to come back," he said. "And I told you I don't take orders for free," Rachel said, walking in and setting the cardboard drink carrier and the bodega bag on the desk. She took one of the coffees and handed the other toward him. "Drink this. You look like a corpse, and as I mentioned before, I don't want to deal with the paperwork." Gabriel looked at the plastic cup, then up at her. Slowly, he reached out and took it. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was warm now, no longer clammy with shock, dry and calloused like coarse sandpaper. "Why are you still here, Rachel?" She pulled the desk chair around and sat down, blowing on the rim of her coffee. "Because when I walked it out to my car this morning, there was a black Lincoln Navigator idling across the street from the employee parking lot. Tinted windows, no front license plate. 2 men inside wearing coats that cost more than my car." Gabriel's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Did they see you?" "I'm a night auditor, leaving a shift at 7 in the morning," Rachel said flatly. "I look like part of the scenery. They didn't even turn their heads, but they're watching the exits." Gabriel took a slow sip of his coffee, his jaw tightening. "They aren't police." "I know what police look like," Rachel said. "Police look bored. Those men looked like they were waiting for permission to work." "They're Mateo's people," Gabriel said, speaking more to the wall than to her. He set the coffee down on the nightstand. "My former lieutenant. He decided the retirement package I offered him wasn't generous enough. He wants the port contracts. The only way he gets them is if I'm not around to sign the renewals." Rachel absorbed this information without a flinch. She took a drink of her coffee, the bitter, scalding liquid burning a path down her throat. "So what's the play? You sit in this room until they get tired and go home?" "They don't get tired," Gabriel said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, expensive smartphone. The screen was shattered, the casing dented by whatever impact had taken him down the night before. It was completely dead. "I need to make a call, but if I use the hotel phone, Mateo's people at the switchboard downtown will trace the extension within 3 minutes." Rachel reached into the bodega bag, pulled out the cheap $50 prepaid burner phone she had bought 10 minutes ago, and tossed it onto the mattress next to him. It landed with a light thwack against the quilt. Gabriel stared at the small plastic device for 3 seconds. Then he slowly raised his eyes to hers. There was a strange, unfamiliar expression shifting behind his dark gaze. Not surprise, exactly, but a deep, profound reassessment. "You bought a burner," he said. $50 at the corner bodega," Rachel said, crossing her legs and leaning back in the wooden chair. "I added it to your tab. That's $10,050 you owe me now." A slow, genuine smile. Not the razor-thin smirk from the night before, but a small, tired curving of his lips broke across Gabriel's face. It transformed him, stripping away 10 years of hardened, terrifying authority and leaving behind a man who was simply exhausted, sharp, and intensely alive. "You're a very unusual woman, Rachel Hayes," he said, picking up the burner phone and popping off the back cover to check the battery. "I'm practical," she corrected him. "If you get shot in my hotel, the police shut down the building for a crime scene investigation. If the building is shut down, I lose my shifts. If I lose my shifts, I can't pay my rent. My survival is directly tied to your immediate departure. Don't mistake basic economics for empathy." Gabriel punched a series of numbers into the tiny keypad with his right thumb. He didn't take his eyes off her face as he waited for the line to connect. "Empathy is overrated," Gabriel said softly as the phone began to ring against his ear. "Economics I can trust." The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Gabriel spoke in low, rapid Italian, a series of sharp, clipped directives that sounded less like a conversation and more like a tactical deployment. When he disconnected, he dropped the phone back onto the mattress and looked at Rachel. "My people are clearing the block," he said. "It will take 4 hours. Matteo brought a heavy team. If my men move too fast, it turns into a firefight on 4th Street, and the city council gets involved. We have to wait until midday when the traffic masks the movement." 4 hours. Rachel looked at her watch. 8:15 a.m. She should leave. She had delivered the phone. She had warned him about the navigator. Her obligation to her own survival instinct was complete. Instead, she stood up, walked to the small, grimy window looking out over the alley, and leaned her hip against the radiator. It clanked and hissed, throwing off a meager, dry heat. "Why haven't you ever been married?" Gabriel asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She turned her head, her gray eyes narrowing. "Is that what you ask all the women who fish bullets out of your arm?" "I don't usually let women fish bullets out of my arm," Gabriel replied, stretching his long legs out in front of him, crossing his boots at the ankle. He looked entirely at home in the dingy, faded room, like a wolf resting in an abandoned shed. "And I'm asking because I've spent 32 years watching people. I know what someone looks like when they have a person waiting for them at home. There's an impatience, a clock ticking in the back of their head. You don't have a clock, Rachel. You look like you could sit in that chair for 3 days and nobody would call the police to ask where you are." The observation hit her with the clean, sharp force of an open-handed slap. It didn't hurt. She had immunized herself against that kind of pain years ago. But the accuracy of it was unsettling. "I don't have a clock," she admitted, her voice flat. "My father left when I was 6. My mother spent the next 15 years looking for someone to pay the rent, usually moving us into apartments owned by men who drank too much and shouted at the walls. She died 2 years ago, liver failure, left me $40,000 in hospital bills and a collection of cheap costume jewelry." She turned her face back to the grimy window, watching a pigeon land on the brick ledge outside. "Love is a trap for people who don't know how to read the fine print," she continued. the words slipping out with a quiet, practiced cynicism. It's a transaction where both sides lie about what they are bringing to the table. The man pretends he wants a partner when he really wants a caretaker who doesn't charge by the hour. The woman pretends she wants a soulmate when she really just wants someone to stand between her and the wolf at the door. Eventually, the mask slips, the contract breaks, and whoever has the least money loses. She turned back to look at him, expecting the usual reaction, the defensive posture of a man told that his romantic notions were just biological programming and financial fear. Gabriel wasn't defensive. He was staring at her with the intensity that made her skin prickle. He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes absorbing her words, turning them over, validating them with his own brutal experience. "You're half right," Gabriel said quietly. "Only half?" "You're right that it's a transaction," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant register that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Most people are weak. They use love as a shield to hide from how incompetent they are at surviving on their own. They cling to each other out of terror, not choice." He shifted on the bed, ignoring the grimace of pain that flashed across his features as his left arm pulled. "But you're wrong about the fine print," he continued. "Real devotion, the kind that actually matters, isn't about finding someone to pay your rent or protect you from the wolf. It's about finding someone who sees the exact same ugly, broken world you see and chooses to stand in the fire with you anyway. Not because they need you to survive, but because the fire is quieter when they're in the room." Rachel stood frozen by the radiator. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Men had tried to charm her. Men had tried to intimidate her. Men had tried to buy her drinks and tell her she was too pretty to look so sad. But no one had ever looked at her armor, recognized the exact alloy of trauma and cynicism it was forged from, and told her that it wasn't enough to keep the cold out. "And I suppose you have that?" she asked, her voice slightly thinner than she intended. "With someone in your syndicate?" Gabriel laughed, a dry, raspy sound that held zero humor. "In my world, if I show a weakness, 3 men try to poison my drink before the appetizer is served. If I take a woman, she becomes a target within 24 hours. My life is a balance sheet of leverage and violence, Rachel. There is no room for fire." He looked up at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers across the dim room. "Which is why you're the first person I've had a real conversation with in 5 years. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a strange, static electricity. Rachel felt her pulse in her throat, fast and erratic. She wanted to say something biting, something cynical to re-establish the distance between them. The safe professional distance between a night auditor and a criminal hiding in room 412. Before she could form the words, the heavy brass handle of the door rattled. It wasn't a knock. It was the slow, deliberate jiggling of someone testing a lock with a skeleton key. Gabriel was off the bed before Rachel could even draw a breath. The exhaustion, the pain, the philosophical stillness, all of it vanished in the space of a heartbeat. He moved with the terrifying, silent speed of a predatory animal, his right hand drawing the Glock from his waistband as he pushed Rachel hard against the wall beside the door, out of the line of fire, his body pressed against hers for a split second. Hard muscle, the heat of fever, the smell of copper and dark coffee, before he stepped back, raising the weapon toward the wooden panels of the door. "Stay down," he breathed, his lips barely moving. Outside, a voice spoke. It wasn't the morning manager. It was a thick, heavy voice with a pronounced East Coast drawl. "Hey, maintenance," the voice said through the wood. "We got reports of a leak on this floor. Open up." Rachel looked at Gabriel. His face was a mask of cold, calculated murder. He raised his left hand, holding up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the corridor, indicating there were at least 2 men outside. He raised the gun, aiming directly at the center of the door where a man's chest would be. If he fired through the wood, it would be a slaughter. The noise would bring the police within 10 minutes. The St. Clair would become a war zone, and Rachel Hayes would be standing in the middle of it with a dead man's blood on her cardigan. "I don't keep my head down because I'm afraid," her own voice echoed in her mind. "I keep my head down because looking up is a waste of energy." Without asking permission, without waiting for Gabriel to signal, Rachel took a step forward, reached out, and twisted the deadbolt. Gabriel's eyes went wide. A rare, genuine flash of absolute shock as she pulled the door inward 3 inches, leaving the heavy brass safety chain engaged. Through the narrow gap, she stared into the face of a man she had never seen before. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy blue workman's jacket over a black turtleneck. Behind him stood a second man, his right hand resting inside the deep pocket of a leather coat. Neither of them carried plumbing tools. "What do you want?" Rachel snapped, her voice dripping with the exhausted, irritable venom of a night shift worker who had just been woken from a dead sleep. She didn't open the door wider. She stood blocking the gap, her shoulder braced against the frame. The man in the workman's jacket blinked, surprised to find a young woman in an oversized cardigan instead of a bleeding syndicate boss. He tried to look past her into the dim room, but Rachel shifted her weight, deliberately blocking his line of sight. "Maintenance," the man repeated, though his eyes were cold and assessing. "We're checking for a pipe leak from the 5th floor. Need to look at the bathroom." "There is no 5th floor above this wing," Rachel said flatly, her tone radiating pure, unadulterated bureaucratic boredom. "This is the South Annex. Roof is directly over our heads. If there was a leak, it would be coming through the plaster, and as you can see," she gestured vaguely to the dry ceiling behind her. "It's dry. Now, who are you? Because Arthur is the only maintenance guy on shift today, and you're not Arthur." The man's jaw hardened. He took a step closer, his boot wedging against the bottom of the door frame to prevent her from closing it. "We're private contractors. Building management sent us. Open the door, miss." "No," Rachel said. She didn't back away from the door. She leaned into it, her eyes boring into his with the absolute, unshakable confidence of someone who knew the exact legal bounds of her territory. "I work the front desk. Building management doesn't sign off on contractors without submitting a work order to the overnight ledger, which I audited 4 hours ago. You don't have a work order, you don't have tools, and if you don't take your boot off my door frame in 3 seconds, I'm calling the emergency line to report 2 trespassers trying to force entry into a guest room." She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her own cracked personal cell phone, holding it up so the screen illuminated her cold, expressionless face. 3 seconds, she said. 1. The man in the leather coat behind the lead guy muttered something under his breath. A low, nervous, "Let's go, it's not him, she's just a desk jockey," and grabbed the workman's sleeve. The lead man stared at Rachel for a long, tense second. He was trying to see through her, trying to detect the flutter of a pulse, the dilation of pupils, the faint, unmistakable scent of adrenaline that gave away a lie. Rachel gave him nothing. She looked at him the exact same way she looked at drunk guests trying to dispute a minibar charge, with absolute soul-crushing indifference. "Sorry to bother you, miss," the man said finally, pulling his boot back into the hallway. "Must have the wrong wing." "Try the north building," Rachel said, and slammed the door shut. She threw the deadbolt, clicked the mechanical lock, and stepped backward, her spine hitting the faded floral wallpaper of the corridor wall. For 3 seconds, she didn't breathe. She listened to the heavy, muffled sound of their boots receding down the carpeted hallway, followed by the distant, metallic clang of the stairwell door opening and closing. Only then did she let out her breath, a long, ragged, shaky exhale that rattled in her chest. Her knees suddenly felt like they were made of damp paper. She slid down the wall, her hands trembling violently as the adrenaline flush hit her nervous system like a freight train. A shadow fell over her. Gabriel stood there, the Glock lowered at his side. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking down at her, his dark eyes wide, stripped entirely of their usual cold armor. Slowly, deliberately, he dropped to one knee in front of her, ignoring the sharp pull of his bandaged bicep. He reached out, his warm, calloused hand cupping the side of her face, his thumb tracing the sharp, trembling line of her cheekbone. "You could have been killed," he whispered. His voice wasn't angry. It was thick with a strange, overwhelming wonder. If he had pushed that door, "He wouldn't," Rachel gasped, her voice shaking as she leaned her cheek instinctively into the warmth of his palm. A physical reaction she couldn't stop. People like that. They expect fear. They expect you to run or scream or shoot. They don't know what to do with someone who wants to talk about work orders. Gabriel let out a low, breathless sound. This time, it really was a laugh, rich and dark and full of relief. He slid his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the dark hair at the base of her skull, and pulled her gently forward until her forehead rested against his healthy shoulder. "You are extraordinary," he murmured into her hair. "You know that, don't you? You're the most terrifying person in this city." Rachel closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of him, the dark coffee, the antiseptic, the underlying scent of cold winter air and heavy wool. For the first time in 25 years, she didn't feel the need to calculate the cost of the moment. She just let herself be held. The sun had reached its zenith beyond the gray fog, casting a pale, diffused light through the grimy window of room 412. They didn't move from the floor for a long time. Eventually, Gabriel pulled her up, his hand never leaving her waist, and guided her back toward the stripped bed. They sat side by side against the wooden headboard, their shoulders touching, the cheap prepaid phone resting on the mattress between them like a ticking timer. The silence between them had changed. The transactional distance was gone, burned away by the 30 seconds of terror at the door. "How did you end up here, Gabriel?" Rachel asked quietly, turning her head to look at his profile. It was the first time she had used his name. It felt heavy on her tongue, intimate and dangerous. Gabriel looked down at his own right hand, his thumb tracing the split skin across his knuckles. "My father," he said, his voice level, devoid of self-pity. "He built the syndicate in the 80s. When I was 18, I wanted to study architecture. I had a scholarship to a university in Chicago. I had my bags packed, sitting by the front door." He paused, a dark, cynical shadow passing over his eyes. The night before I was supposed to leave, two men from a rival family intercepted my older brother outside a restaurant on Grand Avenue. They put 6 bullets into his chest. My father called me into his study while my brother's blood was still on the street. He told me the scholarship was gone. He told me that in our family, you don't get to build things that last. You only get to protect what you already hold. Gabriel turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers. I spent the next 14 years turning myself into the monster my father needed me to be, he said softly. I eliminated the family that killed my brother. I consolidated the docks. I bought the politicians. I built a fortress out of money and fear so high that no one could ever reach me again. And then yesterday, Mateo, a man I pulled out of a gutter 10 years ago, a man I treated like a younger brother, walked into my office after hours and shot me in the back while I was signing his daughter's baptismal certificate. He let out a slow, bitter exhale. You were right about the fine print, Rachel. People take until there's nothing left, and then they kill you for the empty box. Rachel watched him. She saw the absolute crushing isolation of his existence, an isolation that mirrored her own, but magnified 1,000 times by the sheer scale of his violence and responsibilities. He was a man trapped at the top of a frozen mountain, untouchable and utterly alone, waiting for the day someone finally succeeded in putting a bullet through his heart. Slowly, without calculating the risk, without checking the ledger in her head, Rachel reached out and placed her hand over his split knuckles. Her skin was cool. His was feverish. Gabriel looked down at her hand, then slowly turned his wrist, his fingers opening to twine deeply through hers. He didn't squeeze, he just held on, as if she were the only solid object in a world that was entirely shifting sand. When this is over, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a raw, breathless whisper. When my men clear the block and Mateo is dead, what happens to you, Rachel? I go back to the desk, she said, though the words sounded hollow, even to her. I audit the books, I pay my rent, I survive. Is that enough? Rachel looked at their joined hands. 24 hours ago, she would have said yes. She would have said that survival was the only thing that mattered, that safety was the highest human achievement. But as she looked at Gabriel Castellano, a ruthless mafia boss who had just spent the last 2 hours listening to her cynicism and treating her like an equal, she realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that her armor had a fatal flaw. It kept out the pain, but it also kept out the air. She was suffocating in her own safety net. No, she whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. It's not enough anymore. Gabriel didn't answer with words. He leaned in, his right hand coming up to cup the back of her neck, pulling her close until their mouths met. There was nothing gentle or performative about the kiss. It was hard, grounded, and born of a desperate, mutual survival instinct. It tasted of bitter black coffee, adrenaline, and the cold, unshakable truth that they were two broken people who had suddenly found the exact same rhythm in the dark. He pulled her across his lap, his uninjured arm wrapping tightly around her waist, lifting her against his chest as if he wanted to absorb her directly into his bones. Rachel didn't pull back. She buried her hands in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck, opening her mouth to his, matching his intensity with a fierce hunger of her own. The hunger of a woman who had starved herself of human contact for 25 years to avoid getting hurt. finally deciding that the fire was worth the burn. Outside room 412, the city sirens wailed in the distance, and the wet November fog pressed against the glass. But inside, for one brief, stolen afternoon, the ledger was balanced. At 1:15 p.m., the cheap prepaid phone on the mattress buzzed. A single, sharp vibration that shattered the quiet of the room like a gunshot. Gabriel broke the kiss, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against Rachel's. For 3 seconds, he didn't move to answer it. He just held her tightly against his chest, his eyes closed, as if trying to memorize the sensation of her weight in his arms before the real world came rushing back in. Then, the ruthless syndicate boss returned, his spine straightened. The softness vanished from his jaw, replaced by that cold, hard granite set. He reached over, picked up the phone, and pressed it to his ear. "Speak," he said. He listened for 40 seconds. His eyes didn't leave Rachel's face, but she could see the calculation turning over behind them. The strategic map of the city rebuilding itself in his mind. The names, the streets, the angles of fire. "Where is Mateo?" Gabriel asked. A pause. "Good. Tell Leo to secure the south exit of the alley. I'm coming down in 2 minutes. Bring the black sedan, not the SUV, and have a medical technician waiting at the safe house on Elm Street." He ended the call and dropped the phone into his coat pocket. He looked at Rachel, who had already moved back to her side of the mattress, her fingers smoothing down the front of her cardigan with a mechanical, nervous precision. The intimacy of the last hour was suddenly evaporating, replaced by the cold, hard geometry of their reality. "My men have taken the street," Gabriel said, standing up. He reached for his dark overcoat, his face tightening in pain as he slung it over his shoulders, concealing the bloody bandage and the gun tucked into his waistband. "Mateo is cornered in a warehouse on the river. It's over." Rachel stood up, walking over to the small desk to collect her empty coffee cup and the bodega plastic bag. Her hands were steady again, her face returning to that flat, unreadable mask. "Congratulations," she said, quietly. "You survived your stay at the Grand St. Clair. I'll make sure to waive the resort fee." Gabriel walked across the room, stopping 2 inches from her. He reached out, his hand closing over her wrist, stopping her from cleaning up the debris. "Come with me," he said. The words were spoken with absolute authority, but beneath them, Rachel heard the quiet, desperate urgency of a man who knew he was about to walk back into a frozen cage and didn't want to go alone. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, heavy, warm, calloused, and then up into his dark, bottomless eyes. "To where, Gabriel?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "To a safe house with armed guards at the door? To a fortress where I spend my days wondering if the tea is poisoned or if a car bomb is going to go off when I turn the ignition? I told you, I'm not built for your world." "I can protect you," he said fiercely, his grip tightening. "No one would ever touch you, Rachel. I would burn this city to the bedrock before I let anyone come near you." "I don't want to be protected in a bunker," she shouted, the sudden explosion of emotion surprising them both. Her chest heaved, tears finally prickling the corners of her sharp gray eyes, not tears of sadness, but of profound, frustrated reality. "Don't you see? If I go with you, I become your liability, and you become my death sentence. Every time you leave the house, I'd be sitting in a chair, watching a clock, waiting for a phone call telling me you were found in an alley with 6 bullets in your chest." She pulled her wrist free of his grasp, stepping back toward the door. "I spent 25 years avoiding the fine print of love because I knew it would destroy me," she whispered, her voice dropping to a trembling rasp. "I'm not going to sign a contract that guarantees one of us ends up in a morgue by spring." Gabriel stood frozen in the center of the dingy room. His tailored overcoat hung off his broad shoulders like a shroud. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his jaw working as he fought against the undeniable, brutal truth of her words. He was Gabriel Castellano. He owned half the city. He could command 50 armed men with a single phone call. But he could not change the physics of his world. He could not make it safe for a woman who just wanted to audit ledgers and live without a clock ticking in her head. Slowly, he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy black leather notebook. He ripped a blank page from the back, took a silver pen from his lapel, and wrote down a series of numbers. He walked over and placed the folded paper onto the desk, right beside her empty coffee cup. "That is my personal private line," Gabriel said, his voice flat, hollow, and stripped of all emotion. "It doesn't go through the switchboard. It doesn't get traced. It rings directly in my pocket." He paused, his eyes tracing the line of her mouth one last time, as if trying to permanently etch the memory of her face into his brain. "If you ever need anything, if the rent is short, if the hotel closes, if someone looks at you the wrong way on the street, you call that number. You understand?" Rachel looked at the folded paper. "I told you, Gabriel, I'm done paying." "You don't pay for this," he said softly, turning toward the door. "This is on my ledger, for the rest of my life." He opened the door, stepped out into the dim, dusty corridor of the 4th floor, and didn't look back. A moment later, the heavy metallic clang of the stairwell door echoed through the empty hall, leaving Rachel Hayes standing entirely alone in room 412. 3 weeks passed. The November fog turned into a bitter, freezing December sleet that coated the streets of the city in a layer of dirty gray ice. At the Grand St. Clair, nothing had changed. The brass railings were still tarnished. The lobby still smelled of old carpet cleaner, and Arthur, the morning manager, still complained about his chronic acid reflux every morning at 7. Behind the mahogany desk, Rachel Hayes worked her shifts. She wore her oversized wool cardigan. She audited the ledgers. She checked in the late-night travelers, the traveling salesmen, and the couples who paid in cash and didn't look each other in the eye. To anyone else, she was exactly the same. Quiet, efficient, and entirely invisible. But inside, Rachel was bleeding out. Her old cynicism, the heavy, comfortable armor that had protected her from the world for 25 years, no longer fit. It had been cracked open in room 412, and now the cold air was rushing in. She found herself watching the revolving glass doors at 3 a.m., her heart executing a hard, painful thump every time a man in a dark coat walked through. She found herself reading the city metro newspapers, scanning the crime briefs and the obituaries with a sickening, hyper-aware dread. Looking for the name Castellano, she learned that Mateo was dead, found in a burned-out car near the docks 3 days after Gabriel had left the hotel. She learned that the Castellano syndicate had consolidated its hold on the shipping lines, that the city council had suddenly approved 3 new development projects on the waterfront, that peace had returned to the underworld. Gabriel had won. He was safe at the top of his frozen mountain, and Rachel was suffocating at the bottom of hers. The $10,000 was still sitting in an envelope taped under her spare tire. She hadn't spent a single dollar of it. Every time she looked at her car, the money felt like a tombstone. The final settlement of a transaction that had cost her the only genuine human connection she had ever known. One night at 4 a.m., during the dead, silent nadir of her shift, Rachel opened the top drawer of the reception desk. Beneath her spare pens and her employee badge sat the small, folded piece of paper Gabriel had left on the desk in room 412. Its edges were worn and softened from how many times she had unfolded and refolded it in the dark of her apartment. She stared at the 11 digits written in sharp, bold black ink. Real devotion isn't about finding someone to protect you from the wolf, his voice echoed in the quiet, drafty lobby. It's about finding someone who sees the exact same ugly, broken world you see and chooses to stand in the fire with you anyway. Rachel looked around the empty lobby of the Grand St. Clair. She looked at the tarnished brass, the peeling wallpaper, the glowing blue monitor showing a list of empty rooms that no one wanted to stay in. This wasn't safety. This wasn't survival. It was just a slower, quieter way of dying. She had built a fortress out of boredom and detachment, and it was just as cold and empty as Gabriel's fortress of violence and money. She reached for the heavy black receiver of the hotel desk phone. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered over the plastic handset. If I call him, I step into his world, she thought, her pulse pounding in her ears. I become a target. I give up my invisibility. I sign the contract. She slowly withdrew her hand. She couldn't do it. The fear, the old, deep-seated, generational terror of ending up broken and abandoned like her mother, was still too strong. She folded the piece of paper, put it back into the drawer, and closed it with a sharp, definitive click. She would survive. She always had. At 7 a.m., Arthur arrived to take the desk. Rachel signed the log, grabbed her worn canvas backpack, and walked out through the revolving glass doors into the freezing December morning. The sleet had stopped, leaving the city air sharp and biting, smelling of ozone and car exhaust. She pulled her wool cardigan tight around her chest and began walking toward the employee parking lot at the corner of 4th and Elm. She kept her head down, her eyes locked on the icy sidewalk, watching her own breath plume in white clouds in front of her face. Step 1. Pay the electricity bill, she told herself, ticking off her practical mental checklist to keep the quiet grief at bay. Step 2. Buy groceries. Step 3. Sleep for 6 hours. She turned the corner into the parking lot and stopped dead in her tracks. Idling directly next to her rusted 2011 Honda Civic was a sleek, matte black Mercedes-Maybach sedan. The windows were tinted impossibly dark, reflecting the gray morning sky like two slabs of polished obsidian. There was no front license plate. The engine purred with a low, deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to shake the loose gravel of the pavement. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her hands froze on the straps of her backpack. The rear passenger door of the Maybach clicked open. Slowly, deliberately, a man stepped out onto the icy gravel. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat, tailored perfectly over his broad shoulders, clean and free of bloodstains. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his jaw clean-shaven, his physical presence just as heavy and commanding as it had been 3 weeks ago in the lobby of the St. Clair. Gabriel Castellano looked at her across the 10 feet of freezing parking lot. He didn't look like a wounded animal running from a coup anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, an untouchable, ruthless syndicate boss who owned the street they were standing on and everything within 10 miles of it. But when his dark eyes locked onto hers, the cold armor vanished. "You didn't call," Gabriel said. His voice was low, carrying effortlessly through the crisp winter air. Rachel stood her ground, though her knees were trembling so hard she thought they might give out. "I told you, Gabriel, I don't sign contracts with bad fine print." Gabriel walked toward her. His stride was slow, measured, ignoring the icy patches on the asphalt. He stopped 3 feet away, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her smaller one, blocking out the gray winter street and leaving only the heat of his body and the familiar, intoxicating scent of dark coffee and cold air. "I spent the last 3 weeks looking at my ledger, Rachel," Gabriel said softly, his dark eyes searching every inch of her face, taking in the dark circles under her gray eyes, the thin, exhausted set of her shoulders. "I consolidated the docks. I eliminated every rival who even looked toward my territory. I made this city as quiet as a graveyard." He took a step closer, invading her space, his warmth radiating through the heavy wool of her cardigan. "And every night when I sat at my desk," he murmured, "the room was entirely silent, and I realized that I would rather burn in a fire with you than sit in the cold by myself for another 30 years. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight and aching. "Gabriel, if I'm with you, people will try to use me to get to you. You know how this works. I'll spend my life looking over my shoulder." "Then I'll look over it with you," Gabriel said. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a small, folded document bound in blue legal cover stock. He held it out toward her. Rachel looked at it, confused. "What is this?" "It's a deed," Gabriel said, "to a boutique hotel in Florence, 40 rooms, high ceilings, clean carpets, no syndicate connections, no money laundering, no shell companies, completely legitimate, bought under an irrevocable trust in your name." Rachel stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Gabriel, I don't want you in a bunker, Rachel," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, fierce whisper that seemed to bypass her brain and vibrate directly in her chest. "And I don't want you auditing ledgers in a decaying building for a man who doesn't know your worth. I want you to run something beautiful. I want you to live in the light." "And what about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happens to the syndicate?" "I have 3 lieutenants who have been waiting for me to step back for 5 years, Gabriel said, taking the final step between them and closing his hands over her frozen ones. His palms were warm, steady, absorbing the icy chill from her skin. "They can have the docks. They can have the blood and the money and the mountain. I'm 32 years old, Rachel. I've killed enough men to fill a cemetery. I'm done paying, too." Rachel looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked up into his eyes. There was no deception there. No romantic illusions. No promises of a fairy tale where nothing bad ever happened. She saw a man who had walked through hell, recognized the exact same fire in her, and was now offering to strip away his entire empire just to sit in a quiet room with her without his gun cocked. The armor finally shattered. The 25 years of cynicism, the financial terror, the detachment, it all dissolved into the cold winter air, leaving behind only the absolute, undeniable clarity of what she wanted. "Florence," Rachel whispered, a small, breathless smile finally breaking across her lips. "Does the hotel have a good accounting system?" Because I don't trust Italian tax law. Gabriel let out a low, rich laugh, the sound echoing off the brick walls of the empty parking lot, full of life and warmth and absolute relief. He pulled her into his chest, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could feel the steady, powerful beating of his heart against her ribs. "You can audit the books every night, Mia cara," he whispered into her hair, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against her temple. "As long as you come to bed when the shift is over." Rachel closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face into the collar of his tailored coat. She had never fallen in love at 25 because she had always believed that love was a bad transaction, a loss of control that left you broken and bankrupt. But as Gabriel Castellano opened the door of the black Maybach and guided her into the warmth inside, leaving the frozen parking lot and the Grand St. Clair behind them forever, Rachel realized that the ledger had finally balanced. She hadn't lost her armor. She had simply found someone strong enough to carry it with her. When a man who rules the shadows is willing to step into the light just to share your silence, you realize that real love isn't about finding safety. It's about choosing who you want to stand with in the fire. What did you think of Rachel's choice to trade her armor for a life in Florence with Gabriel? Would you have taken the risk? Let us know in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance drama lovers, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.